favorite letter R among my guests.
Good morning.
Good morning. Well, there's a lot to discuss. I mean, obviously, the context of our conversation has to do with your expertise as an international humanitarian law expert. I think we have discussed the Middle East, what's going on in the Middle East, also in our previous episodes. Although ngayon, of course, the reality is even more stark and poignant. But before that, Attorney Caranza, let's be a little bit parochial. Let me be a little bit selfish and let's focus on something Filipino for a while before we go to the more international aspect, which still is relevant to us. First of all, anong basa mo dito sa progression of the whole confidential fund saga? Particularly, it looks like there's a lot of backlash and there's also a lot of, I don't know, house cleaning, if I can look at it, or recalibration even by the powers that be, except it's at the expense of one faction of the ruling elite rather than the entire faction of the ruling elite. How are you looking at this entire drama, Attorney Caranza? more like Marcos via Romualdez versus
Yes.
because if you look at BBM himself, he tries to be above the fray, and I think that sort of plausible deniability is very important. But before going to that Bardagulan and the whole Tambaluslos one, let me rewind a little bit. Exactly, that's the reason. The reason why I wanted to ask you, Attorney Caranza, is because you serve in the Department of National Defense, which is national defense, right? All of these things we're hearing from the Dutertes about defense. Well, that is your job when you're in the Department of National Defense, but you're also with PCGG, which had to do with good governance. So the question basically here, Attorney Caranza, is under what I know you're categorically skeptical, to just put it nicely, but for the sake of argument, under what circumstances can a confidential fund make sense? So, for instance, we had Secretary Llamas as a guest, and he talked about how Pinoy, as the president, they had quite minimal compared to what comes later on under Duterte, but nonetheless, the president had a confidential fund. And then, what are the safeguards, or what is a golden mean? Like a while ago, you said something like, it doesn't have to be confidential fund, but it can be somewhere like you can just report to the Commission of Edit, because if you give too much details, then if it's a national security relevant one, then alam ng kalaban anong ginagawa mo. Kunyari, you cannot say bumili kami ng 10 AK-47 or 10 ISR. I mean, so obviously there's an argument to it, but what's the golden mean, and what are the circumstances under which you think confidential fund makes sense? Because under the Aquino administration, the president had confidential fund, although nothing close to what will come later under Duterte or BBM.
It's both a cultural and a legal issue. Legally, you do have an argument for not disclosing how you will spend certain line items in your budget because they're confidential, because they're intelligence funds. And you can have a rule legally where you only allow certain agencies rather than certain activities, right? Agencies, not activities, to have access to these types of funds. So that narrows it down considerably. You can have national defense, you can have the PCGG, you can have national intelligence agencies, the National Bureau of Investigation.
Tugma dun sa mandato nila, talaga tugma sa training.
Right, but I wouldn't stop there legally, because within that group of agencies, you still have to narrow exactly why they will spend this money for what. And that's where the trouble is, because even within those agencies, there's a lot of corruption. Even within these agencies, there's a lot of non-accounting of how this money is spent. They would usually say reward money, they would say money for confidential informants, money for whistleblowers. Then call it that, right? Put it in the budget as money for whistleblowers or money for confidential informants. You obviously, you don't have to detail who the confidential informants are. There's a witness protection program, for example, in the Department of Justice. That's allocated as a line item in the Department of Justice budget for witness protection. Do you need to specify the witnesses you protect? No. So there, in other words, you do have a civilian example of what these military and police agencies ought to do when they want access to these types of funds. But on the cultural side, that's a problem. This always comes down to power. That these people think that dispensing power requires access to corruption. That's really what it is. They obviously, you cannot put a budget line for corruption, so you call it something else, confidential fund.
And if you ask what's going on, well, it's confidential, right? You just look it that way. No,
yeah, it's a tautology, so it's ridiculous. And
I know. Right. Just for technicality purposes, what's the difference with the maintenance and other expenses, yung MOE? Kasi, kunyari, itong ginawa nila, di na confidential sa DepEd, lalagay na lang natin sa MOE. Like, what's going on there?
Well, in government accounting, that should have been very basic, right? Maintenance of your facilities, of what you do day to day. So, everything you usually do, and other expenses, and that already covers salaries, that covers gasoline, that covers things that make you function. That's spying. Is spying part of your regular activity? Now that's where the arguments we already know come in, right? Why would the Department of Education need money to spy on people? Then maybe you're not educating, you're spying. So I think that's the difference. And when politicians get away with stretching this concept of what a line item in a budget is for, it's meant for this but not for that, you might as well get rid of the budgeting process. You might as well not have any of these distinctions, because you might as well not have a commission on audit and just leave it to congressmen and senators to decide how much will be stolen from corruption and how much will be left to spend on the public.
Attorney Caranza, are you, I don't know if the word impress is right, but are you surprised that the Commission on Audit, regardless of changes in leadership, we can debate about whether the right persons are now there, etc. That in fairness naman, it looks like pretty consistent sila in indirectly exposing some gaps, loopholes, if not anomalous practices out there. And at the same time, you also have the Office of Ombudsman coming out now and essentially telling them, hey, to back off, something along those lines. I mean, and then you have also people, I don't know, Congressman Richard Gomez, something like, wag niyo masyado i-publicize para hindi mapaya yung ibang tao. May mga ganon, no? So parang, what's going on here? I mean, first of all, are you surprised that the audit folks have not been neutered? Or is this just like performative transparency and then that's really it? Because you can be cynical and say, of course, this is part of the performativity. See, my commission on audit naman, in-expose naman. So we're a democracy, right? You know what I'm saying? Like, there could be levels of cynicism there. But for Ombudsman to come in and all, is this a next level kind of thing going on because we have a Duterte and BBM in power or not?
And that's actually the right starting point to answer you, because once a country elects a family that stole $5 to $10 billion from them, there is no bar anymore to outrightly defending corruption. So when the Ombudsman of the Philippines, supposed to be a constitutional office that checks every single branch of the government, even to some extent the Supreme Court, comes out and says, we don't have to publish the statement of assets and liabilities of public officials, it's essentially saying, they can commit corruption in secret. We don't have to show how much they earned from corruption. And that's because when you're a country that elects the Marcoses, puts them back in power after they stole billions from you and lie about it, then there is nothing that stops people like an ombudsman who got appointed by Duterte. There's nothing that prevents corrupt politicians from coming out now and saying, we don't have to be checked. We don't have to be required to disclose our income. We don't have to be exposed to public scrutiny. Because what? You're not public officials? That's the problem. The Commission on Audit functions because you have a bureaucracy in place. And to that extent, that's the value of having a civil service that isn't affected by political change to a large extent. But as we know, the Civil Service Commission, as an example, it's fine from a certain salary grade downward. The problem will be in appointing higher level officials. The same thing with the Commission on Audit. They audit mayor's offices, they audit fire departments, and then you find out that a fire department bought a truck secondhand but describe it as first-hand, and everyone goes to jail for that. You find a city market treasurer absconding with money, and she goes to jail for that. But not Elda Marcos, right? Who stole 500 times more than anyone else in the Philippines. So did the Commission on Audit play a role in checking her? Of course not, because the Commission on Audit was headed by someone close to Ferdinand Marcos during the dictatorship. When Chofisto Gingona Sr. became Commission on Audit chair right after the dictatorship, there was an audit of all the Marcos debts and all the foreign aid that was sent to the dictatorship, and that's when they found out that the Marcos dictatorship, for example, used USAID money for Imelda Marcos shopping spree. So while we think the Commission on Audit does its job, and these are bureaucrats and civil servants who are professional, who follow certain standards, that's fine. But I think we need to have them do more than what they're used to doing with regular government agencies, that have little money and therefore little corruption and therefore not much to check.
I saw some, I don't know, was it authentic or not? May nag-circulate online na some sort of a Malacanang document na intelligence or confidential fund for Imelda or something like that. I mean, can we talk about the genesis of this whole practice? Is this an Imeldific Marcos legacy thing, or is this something common among developing countries and we just copied from someone else? How original is this whole confidential fund saga?
Dictators everywhere, not just the Philippine dictator, have always, for some perverse reason, tried to find legal excuses for their corruption. Why they do that, I think, has to do more with outward appearance towards people other than their citizens than to their citizens. So other dictators commit corruption. Augusto Pinochet was corrupt. The Argentine junta was corrupt. South Korea's Chun Doo-hwan and the other dictators that followed him were all corrupt. They were also brutal, but we're talking about corruption. So it's not exclusive to a Filipino dictator. What is exclusive is the fact that we re-elected the same people who stole from us. Augusto Fujimori of Peru was corrupt. Right. Augusto Fujimori was corrupt, Peruvian dictator. He was ousted. His daughter tried to run for president. She lost.
3 times you ran? Like how many times
Right.
now? You've lost count.
You do have this daughter of one of the former dictators of Korea running and actually winning, and then exposed for corruption and forced to resign. So that document, maybe we're talking about I don't know, this memo that tells the Philippine National Bank
exactly.
to give Imelda Marcos her shopping money when she arrives. There's a PNB branch here in New York, so that's the same branch that gave her money, and then they take it out of the so-called intelligence fund, which is just rigmarole, because what's the point? You're a dictator, so you don't even have to account for. It's just PNB, like I said, trying to show to its foreign banking partners that there has to be some way to justify what is going on. But really, internally within the dictatorship, they couldn't care. Imelda Marcos, for instance, converted part of the National Food Authority's money into an intelligence fund, stole from the NFA, the same agency that is now in charge of trying to lower the price of rice in the Philippines. So kahit yung ahensya na nagpapatakbo ng pagkain at ang presyo ng bigas sa Pilipinas, dinakawan ng mga Marcos. In fact, the Sandigan Bayan ordered them to pay what was found, only what was found, lost 10 million pesos. Hanggang ngayon, hindi pa binabayaran ni Imelda Marcos. So, ginawang intelligence fund ang pera para pambili ng bigas.
The reason I asked this because don't say some podcast go with Leloy Claudio. Of course, we go history, right? We talk about all sorts of secret history of the Philippines. One of the things that we discussed was how actually the term crony capitalism is perhaps a Philippine invention. That way before talking about the Russian oligarchs and all of that, na-invento ng Pilipinas. Kaya in that context, I ask you the question if this intelligence confidential fund tradition, if I can put it, if this is another only in the Philippines or authentic contribution natin to humanity. That's why I ask about it, no? But I have another question, Attorney Caranza. Of course, there's the aspect of, to put it mildly, performative transparency or rule of law, right? Because you want to show to the world, no, we operate by rule of law, and that's what makes modern dictators. I mean, old despots didn't give a heck. They would just massacre half of the villages and they'll say, you're my subjects. difference with the modern dictator is that they pretend that there's institution going on there. But the other thing I've noticed, especially since the Duterte's coming to power, is what we call securitization, right? This idea that you try to shut down any kind of rational evidence-based debate by saying no, this is a matter of national security. So nung kino-question yung confidential fund, and later on this will be relevant as we discuss the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, because actually the context of the term securitization starts with how this operate in countries like Israel, for instance, under certain right-wing administrations. But speaking of the Philippines, we see with Duterte's, no, if you question, for instance, si Sara Duterte, diba, nung kino-question yung kanyang confidential fund, she immediately goes there, I don't know, event with some police folks and says, yung mga nag-question ng confidential fund, effectively sila yung kalaban ng bayan, di ba? Parang it's next, it's not even like defending herself on good governance ground. It's immediately, pushing it back to you, and not only gaslighting, it's something even more say menacing for some people. Is this something new in your opinion, or don't you think this makes Duterte a bit different from our current version of Marcos? Because at least in the case of Marcos Jr., don't see him doing that securitization thing, right? While with Duterte, that's quite consistent from the father to the daughter.
I think when you've stolen $5 to $10 billion already, there's really no need for you.
Ano yung busog ka na, solve ka na, ganun yung argument.
Well, yeah, to some extent, yes, but also to the extent that you've done it with over 20 years, and you needed 20 years to do it, and you needed 20 years of brutal dictatorship to do it. You probably think that it's enough of a lesson for you to find another way to commit corruption without having to go through the brutality of it, and not because you don't want to be brutal, but because it takes too long. And with the internet, with social media, with so much transparency available, it's not going to be something that you could do the way you did it 36 years.
Some learning curve here, like strategic learning, kind of like game theory.
Right. And for the Dutertes, that's why they had to kill so many people when they were in Davao, when Duterte was president, because they only had a short time to do the kind of brutality that they could do nationwide. And in some ways, you might be tempted to think, is this a distinction between a sophisticated set of oligarchs versus a very crude set of oligarchs?
I think the term we use is old new rich versus new rich. To put
right, and then to an extent, maybe that's true as far as their appeal to their populist appeal is concerned. Right, one is this, totally honest about the murder he wants to commit and has been committing. The other relies on lying to deny the corruption that they commit. So, which one do you want? A brutal murderer or a dishonest plunderer? Yun yung choice mo. Doon ka ba sa sinungaling na magnanakaw, o doon ka sa hindi sinungaling na mamamatay tao? Like, what kind of choice is that?
No, Ruben, doon na ako sa party boy. Grand Prix, Formula 1. Medyo
right, except live. That now you have, as you suggested before we start, now, this honest plunderer will create a fund so that they can consolidate all their corruption, and they can steal not in retail terms, hindi doon pa isa-isa sa NFA, magnanakaw ako sa probinsya ko, magnanakaw ako doon sa Ministry of Agriculture. Instead, nanakawin ko na lang yung pinakamalaking assets being held by my largest financial institutions, my central bank, my government-owned bank, and call it something that honors my plunderer father. I'll call it Maharlika Fund. So, it's you have a plundering family that has mastered plunder and is now carrying it out. On the other hand, you have a crude murdering family that is still trying to make sure it consolidates power, but has already left a trail of blood and bodies and is trying to transcend that legacy. So it's a terrible set of choices, and there are no good choices in it. I think if you were if you were presenting yourself as an alternative to these two sets of terrible choices, you'll have to address both corruption and human rights violations and say, there has to be something better than just choosing between a corrupt family and a violent family.
Attorney Caranza, since you're in the United States, let me ask you this question. I'm getting a lot of people asking me, especially from abroad, especially those who are beginning to turn against BBM because it's perceived to be hindi na pro-China, right? So you can kiss words, people in, they're saying, these Americans, they may have offered something to the Marcoses, and that's why Marcos is so nice to them. I mean, how much do you think is there to that? Because it's not like Biden controls the courts, right? I mean, the Marcoses have pending court cases, to put it mildly, right? It's not like Biden can tell these courts what to do, right? But does the Treasury Department, for instance, have some leeway in terms of dealing with alleged funds parked in, I don't know, Caribbean or something like that? Like assuming this conspiracy theory is true, I mean, how much leeway does the Biden administration or any American president have to supposedly hook in the Marcos? Because that's the argument that many pro-China people are saying, that, Marcos was our boy, except Americans offered them a nicer deal. And they say, I don't know about that. And of course, for me, it's ironic. You didn't have any issues when there were all those pogo and questionable things under the trail. Now suddenly you're concerned about corruption in the Philippines. But I want to ask you, honestly, realistically, what can Biden really offer if he were to be completely realpolitik about this because he cares about China, containing China? Therefore, let's give Marcos whatever he wants. Assuming that's the case, theoretically, what is the leeway there?
2 years ago, in the middle of summer and in the pandemic, I was asked to testify by the Department of Justice here in a case against the Marcoses or involving stolen Marcos assets still being litigated in New York. And the Department of Justice was very serious in supporting the Philippine claim to those assets. In other words, this was an offshoot of the Aquino administration, Benigno Aquino's administration, claiming these assets. These are paintings that were stolen by Pharaoh Vilma Bautista, Imelda's aide from the New York properties of the Philippines, and then hidden for a long, long time. And they came out and they were taken back by the Department of Justice, and I helped them in that measure as well many years ago. So they finally asked me to testify and say, where did these assets come from? Did the Philippines know that these paintings were being hidden? And, I testified on that. But the point I'm making here is that the Department of Justice does what it has to do when it comes to pursuing Marcos assets, when it comes to supporting Philippine government claims against the Marcoses, because it's a professional bureaucracy. They
Exactly.
to a very large extent, they're insulated from changes in administration, and not that there is no way to corrupt that process, not that there is no way to undermine that process. There's constant undermining of that process, not just under Trump, but even presidents before him. But the difficulty here is that you have other interests trying to make sure that the Department of Justice does not lean on one side or the other, because everyone has an agenda. And so in the end, everybody with an agenda has to arrive at a consensus and a compromise of sorts. So maybe let's let the DOJ do its job. I'm saying that because that doesn't mean that there are no other ways to give Marcos what he wants in return for what the United States wants from Marcos. And I'll give you an example. You mentioned the U.S. Bureau of Treasury, which, among other agencies in the U.S., administers sanctions and freezing of assets based on various laws that more or less allow the United States government to freeze assets to prevent travel by refusing U.S. visas, or even to order the arrest if they appear on U.S. soil of persons who are not just convicted but even just suspected of corruption or human rights violations. And Filipinos know one example of that, Kiboloy, right? Son of God or whatever he claims to be. He's not just under FBI investigation. He's subject to these sanctions. One of the more prominent examples is the Global Magnitsky Act sanctions for corrupt officials, for human rights violators. The United States government doesn't impose sanctions, freeze assets, prevent travel based on some objective, applicable to everyone criteria. They use these tools of accountability to promote their power, to pursue their foreign policy interests, to support America's military might elsewhere.
There's
In other words, it's a political tool.
Yeah, so there's a strategic prerogative.
And the fact that they haven't used this on Marcos, and to some extent did not use this on Duterte himself, but on certain individuals around Duterte, under pressure from the U.S. Congress, by the way, shows you that the U.S., by not doing anything against the Marcos family when they could have, when there is legal basis to do so, is giving Marcos what he wants.
Thank you for clarifying that. Exactly, because my argument is, for all the ills of American democracy, their courts are not banana republic courts, right? They have their own logic. And in fairness, we saw even under the Trump administration, despite tremendous amount of pressure he tried to put on many agencies, there was a fight back, there was a resistance. I think the term was the steady state, right? Remember that anonymously written NYTs. Now, of course, we're not exaggerating the healthiness of American state institution, but this is not the Philippines, just to put it mildly. This is not a banana republic, all right? But as I said, my sense is, if there is a place where there could be prerogative or room for maneuver, is the Treasury Department's enforcement or pursuit, right, of certain questionable personalities or individuals and all. Because the reason I know that is because, for instance, we know that the Department of Treasury in the U.S. has tremendous amount of leeway on how to strongly go against American rivals, whether it's China, whether it's Russia, right, whether it's in Iran, for instance, on tech transfers, on oil transfers, etc. So clearly there's a lot of room for maneuver and prerogative there, right? So I just had to clarify that this is not a case of Biden telling courts to drop anti-Marcos cases.
He can't, because those decisions are already final. So
exactly.
as far as those cases are concerned, all he could do, which he did, was to allow Marcos Jr. and Amy Marcos to visit the United States. That's why all of a sudden, like, how was it that Amy Marcos never went to Hawaii? Like, you don't see pictures of her in Hawaii because she couldn't go. She would have been arrested. She fled to Morocco, got a passport there. How is it that Bongbong Marcos, the last time he was in Hawaii was 1995, if I'm not mistaken, never went back? Because that time he was allowed by the U.S. District Court in Hawaii to visit. At that time, there was no contempt judgment yet against the family. So he was allowed to visit, provided he would testify, and he did. So these people suddenly have an itch to travel to the United States. Why? Because the Biden administration allowed immunity, temporary for as long as they're in power, to be given to them. Once they're out of power, the U.S. courts can absolutely enforce their judgments against this family.
Wait, the sovereign immunity also applies to Amy? Or, I mean,
no, these are all in the case of Amy Marcos, let's go technical here. She is not part of the contempt judgment in the District Court of Hawaii.
She's not. Yeah.
Why? Because it's only Ferdinand Marcos Jr. and Imelda Marcos who were held in contempt because they're administrators of the so-called assets of Marcos Sr.
Yeah, I had to clarify that because sovereign immunity, you're talking about president, head of state, right? Yung iba naman, hindi naman head of state. That's what I was wondering.
Right.
Okay, now it perfectly makes sense. Thank you for that. Now, and I think this is a perfect transition to what we really want to talk about. Let's talk about Duterte and then let's go to his pals on the other side, right? ICC. So, what is your sense with ICC so far since last time we talked vis-a-vis Duterte? And I think that's also a segue for our next part of conversation, because Duterte had his own ideas about how to deal with the Gaza situation, right? With his friend on the other side, who right now is also coming under a lot of criticism, and people are also talking about war crimes being committed. But let's talk about Duterte first before we transition to the very thorny issue of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. How was this with Duterte? Well, how's the ICC situation in your opinion?
You know, the ICC prosecutor has won the appeal against the original decision by the prosecutor to open an investigation, right? So that was challenged by the Philippine government under Marcos Jr. So there are obviously still political compromises and negotiations between the Marcos and the Duterte families going on back there. But at the ICC, that doesn't matter. So the investigation has been approved. Technically, what should happen now is for the prosecutor to file charges at the trial chambers and ask that chamber to issue either a warrant or summons to whoever he says should be summoned or issued a warrant for. That hasn't happened. And largely, the reason that doesn't happen is two reasons, actually. Resources. The prosecutor does not have enough resources to spread around. But that isn't really, well, that in part is the fault of the prosecutor and also the states that are members of the ICC in terms of funding, but also because this particular prosecutor has been a prosecutor that wants to please Western governments, opens an investigation into Ukraine, but refuses to act on a 2-year-old investigation in Palestine. So that's, if you want to segue there later, we can segue there.
Yeah,
but there's a second
issue that is more poignant now than ever, right? Yeah.
Right, and there's a second reason why the Duterte case has not moved forward. They can move it forward. They can issue warrants of arrest, but they can't force Duterte or anyone who might be charged in the Philippine situation to appear at the Hague in the so-called confirmation of charges hearing. But even before you get to that, there are other possible openings for litigating this case. The Philippine government and later on Duterte could still challenge these charges. So there's a long way to go, and I think that Filipinos who are awaiting this, again, I always say this, the ICC is not the only way to get justice for victims of the drug war. In the Philippines, you can have justice for victims of the drug war by letting them tell the truth about what happened to them, who these people are who were killed, that they were not drug addicts, or even if they were, that they were entitled to human rights, not to be killed. Give them reparations for what they suffered, for what they lost. These are very poor families. So don't pin all your hopes on the International Criminal Court. At the end of the day, justice is better when it's done at home, because you can build a better home for justice.
What you're saying is the shadow of ICC being there is not the bad thing necessarily, pero wag tayong umasa doon. At the end of the day, we have to push it in turn. So that's an important point, because I think that was not as much fleshed out in the past. And I think every time you and I talk about ICC, there's a lot of excitement and expectation. And I'm not sure it really captures the essence of the struggle at hand here. So thank you very much for emphasizing that.
Nag-uulat, what's new?